So in today's lesson, we're going to talk about psychological disorders. And most of you have probably either taken a class on psychological disorders or have heard of different conditions, but it's based on the DSM typically. So the DSM is now in its 5th edition, and they just released the text revision. So it stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. But it's important to note that this manual was released by the American Psychiatric Association. And that's important information because when we think of the framework of psychological disorders, it doesn't have a cross-cultural lens necessarily. Now, in fairness to the manual, there has been greater effort in the DSM-5 to talk about cultural variability. But the conditions we're going to talk about today are often not reflected in the DSM because they're culture-bound conditions, right? So they're not universal, and that has implications for the DSM. I will tell you that many parts of the world do not use the DSM. They use something called the ICD, right? That's the International Classifications of Disorders. And we're up to, I believe we're coming out with the 11th right now. So that tends to be more open and more progressive in terms of conditions. But there are problems even with the ICD. So that's my framework that we're going to go through. So if I were to ask you, what is a psychological disorder? Does anyone have a sense of what it means to have a psychological disorder?
It's like if you have like schizophrenia or maybe like a bipolar disorder.
Mm-hmm. So those are examples of psychological disorders, but we have to have a general definition, right?
Could it be that certain conditions that could affect the behavior or our moods and even thinking?
Okay. So a disorder refers to any condition that results in significant impairment and interacts or interferes, better yet, with our day-to-day functioning. Now, that is a very, very generic definition. Every condition has with it a series of symptoms, and you have to have a certain number of symptoms within a certain amount of time in order for you to be diagnosed with a disorder. So for example, if I were to ask you, does anyone ever get sad? I bet we all get sad from time to time. But in order to meet the condition for a major depressive episode, you would need to have sadness for most of the days for a minimum of 2 weeks, right? So our mood will fluctuate from day to day, but it usually doesn't stay down for 2 weeks straight most of the day. And you also have to have a minimum of 5 additional symptoms out of the list of symptoms. So it's very, very specific. Now, I will tell you, when I teach psychological disorders, I use a book by Ronald Commer called Abnormal Psychology. And he uses this concept called the 4 Ds. And in order to have a psychological disorder, you have to have the first three, if not all four of the Ds. So the four Ds are deviance, distress, dysfunction, and sometimes danger. Deviance has to be where your behavior is considered outside the norm relative to the society or culture you belong to. Now, it's important that that statement I made, because a lot of conditions would not be considered psychological disorders because they are considered normal within given cultures, right? So that's deviance. Distress. Distress means that the condition has to bother you, or in some cases like substance abuse, it has to bother those around you, right? And most of the time it's going to be, you know, you're upset that you don't like feeling that way, right? But in some conditions where there might not be awareness, it could be that the distress is to those around you. Dysfunction is the third D. Dysfunction means it has to interfere with some aspect of your daily living. So it has to interfere with your ability to be a student, let's say, or it has to interfere with your ability to maintain friendships or romantic partners, or somehow it causes conflict in the workplace or creates legal problems and so forth. You get the idea that it has to interfere with some aspect of your daily living. And then danger, not all of the psychological disorders come with danger necessarily, but there are some conditions where it could increase your risk for self-harm or other harm. Self-harm is if you're going to either commit suicide, something like that, or you might engage in parasuicidal behavior such as cutting or self-mutilation. That's a danger to the self, right? So suicidal, parasuicidal behavior, that's danger. But you could also have danger to others, right? And that occurs where a person might develop homicidal ideations, intent, or plan. If that occurs, then there's a danger to another person. So if I were to identify a condition that has higher rates of suicidal ideations, it would be depression. Major depressive disorder comes with a lot of suicidal ideations, and substance use disorders can come with a lot of suicidal ideations. Homicidal ideations come with disorders like schizophrenia, where a person might hear voices or feel like they're commanded to cause harm to another person. So that would be a homicidal ideation. And it could come with personality disorders such as antisocial personality disorder, what you probably you're most familiar with the term a sociopath, right? So these are the 4 Ds, and that's the framework we use when we talk about psychological disorders. But this framework would exclude a lot of culture-bound syndromes. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to use your textbook's definition of a disorder, not the one I just gave you. And then I'm going to talk about some culture-bound or culture-specific conditions that would not necessarily make it into the DSM, but if you were treating a person from a specific community, it's important that you know about these conditions, because that they do cause significant distress, even if it's not in the DSM-5. All right, so again, psychological disorders are defined as rare behaviors that somehow impair the functioning of an individual. Now, we say it's rare because most of us exhibit one or two symptoms of a various condition. But when it comes to psychological disorders, we don't usually meet the threshold for a psychological condition. Now, if we were to take all of the disorders in the DSM and add up all the people that have a condition, it's somewhere between 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 adult and children alike, which means that anywhere between 75 to 80% of people would not have a disorder across their lifespan. So it's clear that the vast majority of individuals don't have a psychological disorder. So it's considered rare. And most of the conditions, when we talk about individual conditions, the probability of having that condition is oftentimes less than 5%, right? Which means that that specific condition is the exception, not the norm, right? So what's the problem with this definition of a disorder? Well, the question you could ask is, well, what type of impairment would be considered problematic, right? And what if the behavior is rare in one context, but not another? So this is a problem. And you know what? Some conditions manifest themselves more frequently in certain cultures relative to others. So if you read the DSM, you're going to get something that says this condition occurs. Let's say we're dealing with anorexia. This condition occurs in 1 to 3% of the population. 1 to 3. Why is there a range, right? You could say, well, hey, there should be a specific number, but you're going to see, and we're going to talk about anorexia, that this is more prevalent in Western societies relative to non-Western societies, right? So the prevalence of the condition is going to fluctuate across cultures. And that's important, right? So there is no set number. Well, what percent of people are diagnosed with schizophrenia? Well, we know it's about 1% if we average out all cultures, but it is going to differ from country to country, from culture to culture. And that's important to know. So here we are, right? So we're going to talk about some culture-bound syndromes. So actually, before I do that, I want to talk about someone that doesn't get enough attention in the literature. There is a researcher and theorist called Thomas Saz, S-Z-A-S-Z, and he absolutely rejects the notion of disorders altogether. He doesn't believe that we should be labeling and categorizing pathology in the sense of disorders. And he said the concept of psychological disorders is flawed because it's so culture dependent. And instead of using the term psychological disorders, Thomas Saz prefers to use problems with daily living. And he believes that this is less stigmatizing than labeling a person with a disorder. And because, you know, there are these biases that it's so culturally dependent, we might be labeling a person with a condition that really, if we knew more about another culture, would not be a psychological disorder. So let's talk about some of these culture-bound syndromes now. So in order for something to be considered a culture-bound syndrome, it requires it to be part of the cultural belief set that's associated with the syndrome, right? So the society that you're part of has to endorse this as part of their cultural value system. So there is a condition called DAT, D-H-A-T, which comes with tremendous anxiety or morbid anxiety related to the loss of one's semen. So South Asian males have tremendous anxiety about what happens if they release their semen inappropriately, right? Because they believe that that's going to cause significant illness. So this causes anxiety about things like masturbation and things like that. So there's a lot of fear about spilling one's seed. And if we were to take religion out of the equation, right, the term dat would be meaningless in terms of a label in the United States, right? Because the United States does not have a prevailing view about the vitality of sperm, and consequently, there's no attitude about the loss of one's or loss of sperm or spilling one's seed. So that's one condition. We also have, in terms of Japanese culture, right, Hikikomori, where a person retreats from, forgive the typo, the social world, and then they kind of like barricade themselves in their room, they isolate themselves. And this comes as a perspective that they don't fit in with society. So they retreat from society. And obviously, by retreating from society, that results in their inability to function properly or succeed in the social world. So what happens with these individuals? Many times they wind up getting lost in books, television, anime, video games, and so forth, right? So this is I don't want to say very common, but it's common enough to be a condition of concern, right? So if we were to look at junior high school and high school, roughly one child per classroom. So we're saying 1 in about 25 individuals are afflicted with hikikomori. So, but if we were to use the DSM-5 as our framework, it would not fit into the expectation of psychological disorders, right? So it doesn't conform to any of that. And, you know, if we were to look at this condition, it was largely not existent in pre-war Japan, which is the culture that it's more prevalent today in. And it's fairly uncommon in the rest of the world. So you can see how this is a culture-bound or culture-specific syndrome. Now, I mentioned this in my preface that bulimia and anorexia, these conditions are far more common in Western societies, such as the United States and European nations. So what is bulimia? Bulimia nervosa is when a person binges and then engages in some form of a compensatory behavior. Now, there are purging and non-purging types of bulimia. Purging is when a person either forces himself to throw up, or they take laxatives, or they take diuretics to urinate. All of these are ways of trying to get rid of calories that they've ingested in large quantities. But there's also non-purging subtypes of bulimia, which include excessive exercise, fasting, restricting one's caloric intake to an extreme sense. These are all compensatory behaviors that are not purging, right? They're non-purging subtypes of bulimia. Now, the assumption behind bulimia and anorexia, which is another one of the eating disorders, is that beauty is related to thinness, right? And I think we talked about in the lecture of attractiveness that in the face, there's clear definitions of what is considered beautiful. But when it comes to the shape of the body, it's not as uniform. So in Western nations, there's a drive for thinness among young women and adults, right? So there's a pressure to be skinnier, skinnier, skinnier. And as a function of that, if a person is not meeting that ideal, people are going to take, I don't want to use the word extreme measures, but they're going to go outside of conventional strategies to lose weight. Now, the challenge with bulimia as well is that because of the process of binging, and a binge eating episode requires you to ingest a minimum of 1,500 calories, right? But most binge eating episodes are even twice that. So if our daily caloric intake is anywhere between 15, 18, 2,000 calories, and you're doubling that in one meal, even if you took a laxative or force yourself to throw up, you're not going to get rid of all of the calories you've ingested. So most people with bulimia, they appear within normal weight and body type, and sometimes slightly overweight. Whereas anorexia, the person is excessively underweight. And I'll talk about that shortly. But the idea of anorexia and bulimia in general, like I said, comes from the idea that one is supposed to be thin, and that's beautiful. But that isn't the viewpoint of many parts of the world, right? So if we go to Caribbean nations, South American nations, African nations, Asian nations, the prevailing view is not that thinness equals beauty, but rather the more fuller the figure, the more beautiful you are. So the idea of anorexia and bulimia would not be as prevalent there. Now, when it comes to anorexia, anorexia is when a person restricts their caloric intake to the point where they're significantly underweight. So in order to be diagnosed with anorexia nervosa, one has to be 85% of their expected body weight or less. So you have to be very much underweight. And it comes with, as does bulimia, very negative views of one's body, such as in the case of anorexia, a person could be underweight, but when they look in the mirror, they still believe that they're overweight or obese. Now, it's interesting because if they were to be shown another person, they have a much better view, right? So if they look at another person who's underweight or typical weight, they would say, no, that person is thin. But when they look at themselves, it's as if they're looking at a mirror from a funhouse, which changes the morphology. So they don't see themselves the same way. And because they're constantly preoccupied with this idea that they're overweight, they go to extremes to, keep the weight off or lose more weight, such as not eating altogether, excessive exercise again, but this one doesn't come with binges typically. in theory, you could have a combination, which is called bulimorexia. It's not a disorder, but it's an explanation when you have symptoms of both. But typically, this is the case where a person has restricted their weight. And this disorder also comes with a threat to the self. Remember when we talked about self-harm? If a person refuses to eat, they can become 75% of their expected body weight, and in very extreme cases, 50% of their body weight. So if a person is supposed to weigh 120 pounds, let's say, they might be 60 pounds. Now you can think that clearly that puts them at risk of death, right? So this is another example where the person's thinking is so distorted that they might be involuntarily hospitalized so that we can protect them from starving to death. And this is, it's significant because about 1 in 10 of the people who have anorexia or bulimia wind up dying due to either the disorder or features around the disorder. So if there's about 1%, 2% of the country who has this disorder, and then about 10% of that are people who wind up succumbing to the disorder or something associated with the disorder, we're looking at about 1 in 1,000 are dying due to anorexia. That's a significant number. And I will tell you that anorexia and bulimia are 10 times more likely in females relative to males. And I will tell you that in Western societies such as the United States, you will find children on diets as early as elementary school because they believe that they're overweight or they have negative body image. That's concerning. All right. So this condition is a little more complicated than others, right? Because we do have some evidence that it's culture bound or culture specific, right? So we see that in the last 100 years, the rates of anorexia have gone up, particularly from, I want to say, the 1960s forward, right? And then we have some good data from the 70s forward in drops in body image as a whole, right? So, and we've seen that it's primarily found in some cultures relative to others, as I mentioned. So this would suggest that anorexia could be a culture-bound syndrome, but it's in the DSM, right? And I said that, the DSM excludes most culture-bound syndromes. So how did this one make it in? Well, because we do see evidence of universality as well. We do see cases of self-starvation in many cultural concepts. And it's not always linked to body image, but the self-starvation symptoms are more generalized than the body image symptoms. I would argue, though, even with this evidence of universality, it still shows a Western bias in the DSM, if you're going to ask me to evaluate it. So that's my thought, that if we were to follow this principle to a T, then maybe anorexia shouldn't be in a DSM-5. But there are these Western biases. All right. So here's another one of those conditions. It's called Koro. And this is a fear that one's penis is shrinking and receding into their body. This condition is primarily found in South and East Asia. We don't know what aspects of culture led to this belief. Now, we have found it in some other cultures, such as West African cultures. And we've seen in American culture people who've developed beliefs around this linked to marijuana. But anatomically, that is not the case, right? It's anatomically incorrect that would occur. But nevertheless, this exaggerated fear results in people having a lot of, negative view of the self, body image issues, particularly in South and East Asia. All right. We also have amok, which is where a person develops violent and homicidal behavior. Usually it starts with like excessively brooding, thinking, being lost in one's thought. And then after these violent and homicidal attacks, it comes with a mental fatigue and amnesia, not remembering it, right? This is most common in Southeast Asia. And we have this theory called a frustration aggression hypothesis, which we explain why do people lash out. One explanation for amok is that if a person feels they don't have an acceptable outlet to express their frustration, they might lash out. And, we see it to some degree with individuals who are nonverbal. And when people are nonverbal, sometimes they develop frustrations around being nonverbal, and they might hit, they might bite, and so forth. So amok might operate very similar to this. Hysteria. Now, hysteria, it's interesting because this came out of the European worldview in the 1800s. Now, you may have heard of hysteria because of people like Sigmund Freud. Now, how many of you have heard the term hysterectomy? Anyone know what a hysterectomy is? Feel free to raise your hand or shout it out.
Is that? Oh,
Sorry.
Go for it, Mercedes.
Is that where the men get like a procedure on their penis where they can't have kids?
The opposite. No. A hysterectomy is where a female has a medical procedure so that she doesn't have children, right? But when we think about it, the root of hysterectomy is hyster, like almost like a hysterical process. And where does that term come from, right? Hysteria came from the belief, at least according to Sigmund Freud, that women had a wandering womb, whatever that means. And there's something related to this wandering womb that causes emotional distress, feelings of paralysis, inability to move, things like blindness, temporary blindness, insomnia, loss of appetite, loss of one's sex drive, things like this. And Freud suggests it was somehow linked to the uterus, these symptoms. And where did this come from? He was working in a hospital. Now, I don't know if you know this, but Sigmund Freud was a medical doctor. He was trained in neurology and psychiatry. And he was working with individuals who demonstrated these symptoms of paralysis, but there was nothing physiologically wrong with them. And he discovered that the vast majority of these individuals were female, right? And he was wondering, well, what's going on with this? And that's the development of the wandering womb or hysteria idea. And he did research on, in a very small sample, with people like Anna O. He developed his theory and about a dozen other females. But here's the deal. We started to see that this idea of hysteria reduced. It dropped in the 1900s. And the question is, well, if this was a condition of true concern, it should not drop, right? And we discovered that the theory of hysteria was actually incorrect. Now, we do have conditions in the DSM that are similar to this, but we don't link it to women or a wandering womb. So how many of you have heard the term a hypochondriac, right? That's a fairly common term. Now, a hypochondriac is a person who's always preoccupied by the fact that they're either sick or they're going to get sick. So they're constantly seeking out medical interventions for something that's not there. Now, in the DSM, we have a term. We don't use the term hypochondriasis as much, but we use the term conversion disorder. And conversion disorder is one of many somatoform disorders. So somato means body. Form is its morphology. So if you've heard the term psychosomatic, that means that the mind is causing physical symptoms. That's what we believe is going on. The person who was labeled as being hysterical or having hysteria, it was their mind playing tricks on them, which caused these physiological deficits. And one of the interesting things, even during Freud's day, was that when you put a spotlight on the area of deficit, such as blindness or paralysis, and you did hypnosis or whatnot, the symptoms went away, or they moved to a different body part. So it's clear that what was going on was psychosomatic. Now, as I said, hysteria is out. We don't believe it's linked to the womb or the uterus at all. But we do have more concrete terms such as somatoform disorders and more specifically conversion disorder that will fit this one. All right. So let's talk about the next one. Phrygiaphobia is anything that's phobia is an excessive fear, right? But frigio, you might have heard the term frigid or frigidity, which means to be cold, right? So phrygiaphobia is a excessive fear of coldness. And this is found predominantly in China. And people who have phrygiaphobia try and stay out of the cold. They avoid cold food. They dress with several layers of clothing to prevent this. And according to Chinese traditional beliefs, they suggested that working women are particularly more susceptible to phrygiaphobia, and it's caused by things like stress, menopause, and pregnancy, and anemia. So it's interesting, right, that anything can be a phobia, but this one's predominantly in China. And then during the winter, people who develop phrygiaphobia oftentimes report coldness and pain in their extremities, back pain, and things of that nature. So I will say the definition of a phobia is an excessive fear. What do I mean by an excessive fear? A fear that goes beyond rationality. So everybody has some degree of fear about something, but does it become so extreme that it interferes with your day-to-day? So let's say a person has a fear of spiders. There's nothing wrong with a person having a fear of spiders, because historically there are, and presently there are, spiders that could release venom and cause death. But the vast majority of spiders are not that kind. But we develop fear and avoidance of spiders for that matter. But so that's normal. That's a normal fear. But what happens when a person sees a spider and they react so strongly that they run out of the house, or they ball up in a corner at the sight or thought of any spider? Well, that becomes more extreme, and that becomes to the point where a person cannot function. So that would be more of a phobic situation. So it's not just having a fear. The fear has to be in a more extreme sense and result in avoiding whatever the feared thing is. And it has to interfere with your functioning day to day. So that's what a phobia is. And Phrygiaphobia would be the one of coldness. So now we have another one, right? So Susta, which is more of a spirit attack. So a person feels like that their soul has become dislodged from their body. And as a function of their soul becoming dislodged from their body, they develop things like anxiety, nervousness, anorexia, insomnia, fever, depression, diarrhea, things of that nature. But it's Susta, or a spirit attack, is related to the soul, right? So somehow the soul is impacting your physical or psychological function. So, but this is more common, like I said, in Latin America. All right, I see it in the chat. The word is now also related to being scared of something. I appreciate that, because I didn't know that, right? So Susto means to be scared, or if I can use related to a ghost or Halloween sense, spooked out, right? Something spooky. So the next one we're going to talk about is voodoo death, right? Voodoo is a practice that originated in Africa and has been brought to Caribbean nations such as Haiti, Cuba, and many other nations. But the idea of voodoo death is the belief that someone has put a curse on them because they've broken some kind of cultural or societal norm, or they've broken a taboo. And as a function of that, they have a strong emotional reaction, shock, which could lead to death. Now, as I said, this is very, very common in Africa, this belief set, but there is the movement of voodoo came from Africa to the Caribbean. Like I said, in Haiti and Cuba, there's a faith called Santeria, which has a lot of these elements in it. And then actually the voodoo faith in Haiti. All right. So then we have Latta, which is the idea that one becomes dissociated. Dissociation is when one becomes kind of separated or detached from the self. That's what dissociation is. But Latta is where a person has a temporary or transient dissociated state, which is brought on by some kind of startling event, or followed by some kind of culturally inappropriate behavior, and then they don't have memory of what they did. So what this would be most analogous to is when a person has dissociative amnesia, right? Where they become separated, they don't remember. And we have a condition called dissociative fugue, where, and this is interesting, similar to this, where a person in a dissociated state engages in some set of behavior they don't remember, and they could very well move to another place, take on a whole new identity during the fugue-like state. And then when the fugue wears off, the cloudy state wears off, they wonder how they even got there. So there is some kind of parallel condition that we talk about in the DSM. So what are some of the behaviors of Latta? Screaming, cursing, uncontrollable laughter, dancing. This occurs in Southeast Asia, but sometimes occurs in Siberia and a new population of Japan. So we also have Malgra, which is where a person believes that they've been invaded by a totemic spirit, and that makes them feel sick, tired, or drowsy. This occurs in the Aboriginal population of Australia. And when we talk about this, it's interesting because early explanations of psychological conditions was due to possession of a spirit, some kind of spiritual attack. So if you look at the treatment of mental illness, one of the first treatment was a spiritual treatment called exorcism. And if not exorcism, something called trephination. And trephination was a more aggressive process where they drilled a hole into one's head through the skull to create an opening for the spirit to leave, right? So we did at one time collectively believe that the possession of a spirit could cause psychological conditions. And this remains a belief set amongst the Aboriginal Australians. We have now come to a biopsychosocial model, which is slightly different today. Agonias is an anxiety disorder that's linked to burning sensation, loss of breath, sleeping disorders, and whatnot. This feeling of burning and loss of one's breath is more prevalent in areas like Portugal, right? And Azores, which is semi-independent of Portugal. And that's that. Now, we also have, now this one I'm going to try and pronounce, I'm probably going to butcher it. I apologize in advance. Kufunga Sisa, which is more of an anxiety or somatic feature that results in mental exhaustion, or the best way of saying mental exhaustion is what we would call a nervous breakdown. And the belief set is that when you think too much, this causes these anxiety and somatic features. And this is found in Africa, the Caribbean nations, Native Americans, and East Asia. Then we have ataque de nervios, which is literally a nervous attack, right? This comes with symptoms of heart palpitations, numbness, tingling, emotionally charged reactions, usually linked to funerals or death states. So I would describe attack de nervios most similar to a condition we call panic attacks. But this one specifically triggered by things like grief and loss. Now, what did we cover? We did a crash course traveling across the globe of various conditions that are related to specific regions of the world. And you're starting to see that no matter where you are, whether you're a Western nation, European nation, whether you're a non-Western nation, there are specific conditions that are linked to one's culture. Now, they may not make it into the DSM, but they're important for us to know as clinicians. And it's important for us to know as people when we interact with others and they explain, you know, I have this experience and I have this experience and I cannot break free from it, right? So again, I like the fact that you're adding this information, because if you have experience with it, please share, right, related to one's culture, right? So agonia is also related to a state of being after death before one goes to heaven. So it's kind of like that transitory period between one's death and heaven. Thank you for sharing that. All right, so we talked about culture-specific conditions. Now let's talk about universal syndromes, right? So when we have universal syndromes, the belief is that these symptoms are going to occur across the world fairly similarly. So when we have universal syndromes, usually there's some biological basis of that disorder. Now, as I said, prevalence of conditions range from society to society, right? So just because we have these biological universals doesn't mean that it's going to be experienced to the same degree across cultures, right? So it's important to understand that. All right, so let's talk about one of the universals, major depressive disorder. Now, this is a disorder that is in the DSM, right? So a major depressive disorder can be diagnosed as a single episode. It can be diagnosed as a recurring disorder, or it could be diagnosed in relation to some life event or some kind of environmental event. So, as I said, major depressive disorder of a single episode. This is the first time one has been diagnosed with the disorder. Recurrent subtype has to be at least the second time or more, meaning that you've had at least one prior depressive episode. And then like I said, some are environmentally triggered. So we have major depressive disorder with seasonal onset. So that's related to the weather patterns or seasonal patterns. And we can have a winter subtype. We can have a summer subtype of seasonal depression. What else is there? Another environmental event that could result in depression is childbirth. So if you've heard the term postpartum depression, that's actually a major depressive disorder with postpartum onset. But I've explained the various ways that it can manifest. Let's talk about the symptomology. In order to be diagnosed with depression, you have to have 5 out of 9 features. Here are the 9 features. Again, one of the things that I want to impress upon you about the features is you don't need all of them. And this is, as a clinical psychologist, this is one of the reasons why I say you want to treat a person as an individual. Because you can have 20 people with depression, and the symptoms of their depression could vary from person to person. So we still have to treat you as a unique individual. But what are the 9 symptoms? Depressed mood, right? Lasting for at least 2 weeks. Inability to feel pleasure. Now, you can have a reduction of pleasure, or you can have anhedonia, which is a loss of pleasure altogether. You can have changes in weight and appetite that can result in significant weight gain or significant weight loss, because when people develop depression, sometimes they eat more, sometimes they eat less. You could have sleep problems. This could be that you're sleeping more than normal, you're not able to sleep, or your sleep is disrupted where you break your sleep in the middle of the night. You can have psychomotor change. It might feel as if it's harder to get mobilized and move. So like getting out of bed in the morning might be a battle. You might wrestle with your covers, and it might take more time than a typical person to sit up and get moving. Some people with depression say it's as if they're moving with a millstone, a boulder on their shoulders. There is a general sense of fatigue or loss or energy. There's feelings of worthlessness. When we say worthlessness, this is an individual who feels like they have no value and nobody cares about them, things of that nature. We also have people who demonstrate cognitive deficits, such as loss of concentration. And it's interesting because we have cognitive disorders like ADHD, which also have what to do with poor focus. But it's important to understand that it isn't just ADHD where a person could lose their ability to focus or pay attention. You could see poor concentration with anxiety and depression, as you're seeing here. And then sometimes people develop suicidal thoughts, plans, or actions. And we have to be careful with that and treat every statement related to suicide very seriously. So there's ideation, which is the thought, intent, which is the goal, plan is the person is saying, okay, here's how I'm going to commit suicide. And then actions or gestures could also signify it. So when a person says, I'm feeling suicidal, it doesn't mean always that they're at a position where you're going to say, okay, you need to be hospitalized. But we do need to do a suicide assessment to determine your relative harm to yourself or risk of harm to yourself. And we gauge these 4 things in order to make our decision around whether to hospitalize, right? So yeah, thank you for the courage to share that. A person noted that their experience was when they expressed suicidality, they were hospitalized for 3 days. In the event, and I'll explain this from how it operates, certainly the way most psych hospitals work is that if a person, let's say I did a suicide assessment and I said, you know what, this person is at significant risk to hurting themselves. I have to care about you even when you feel you're unlovable, right? I have to protect your safety even when you feel you're worthless. So if I were to deem it necessary for involuntary hospitalization, that is a decision that could be made. When that happens, people can be evaluated for up to 3 days before a decision is made as to whether to hospitalize them ongoing to make sure that they're better, or to discharge. Sometimes people go to the emergency room. There is a subsequent suicide assessment and they're released right away. Other people, it's unclear. And because it's unclear, they say, you know what, we want to monitor them. They go under observation for 3 days to determine whether they're still suicidal. If the person demonstrates that they're no longer suicidal within those 3 days, they're oftentimes discharged. And the vast majority of people are discharged without having longer stays in a hospital. If a person within those 3 days demonstrates that no, there is a significant risk of self-harm here, it is possible that they could have a longer stay, where they say, you know what, this person needs to be placed in a psychiatric hospital, undergo further observation, undergo psychological intervention, perhaps develop a safety plan, perhaps develop, social skills and cognitive skills to reduce the risk of self-harm. That could happen. Now, the average hospitalization is usually a couple weeks. Most people who are even go to the next step of hospitalization, it's not a long-term stay. It's not, I'm sure you might have seen in like Disney, Beauty and the Beast, Belle's father is suggested to be psychotic. So they say that they're gonna lock him away and in a sanatorium, in a psychiatric hospital, and throw away the key, and you're gonna stay there forever. That is not the current approach to treating psychological disorders. As soon as you enter a psychiatric hospital, you have a goal to bring the person back to baseline. It's not even to bring them to their most optimal functioning. If the person develops to a point where they're safe, they're no longer at a harm to themselves or other people, then we discharge them. And like I said, it's usually a couple weeks where that process happens. And there's suicide contracts, safety plans, distress tolerance skills are taught. A whole bunch of things are taught in a hospital. Now, there are some people who have longer stays, but that's not the goal of hospitalization. Now, I will tell you that in New York, there is something called a 3-day letter. If you ever feel that you're being held in a psychiatric hospital against your will, you can write a letter to the judge demanding to present your case before the court within 3 days or less, and it has to be honored. And then if that process occurs, you present why you feel you're safe and why you should not be held in a psych hospital. And it's incumbent upon the hospital who's holding you involuntarily to prove that you're a safety risk, you're a harm to yourself. And if they can't do that, you are ordered by the court to release a person. So that's the interesting protection we have for people that wasn't there in the past. And there's something called a 2PC. 2 independent practitioners must provide a psychiatric assessment and come to the same conclusion in order to maintain you in that psych hospital. So that's the process in the United States. I will tell you that just because that is the process has failed from time to time. There are injustices where people who should be admitted to a hospital are not admitted to a hospital. And then the opposite's true, where there are people who wind up hospitalized who should have been released. So it's not a perfect system because we're relying on psychiatric assessments. So when I think about that, that's a problem. And I see a question, well, what do I think are the flaws with the process? I think that one flaw is that when we're relying on practitioners, they have credibility by virtue of their license. So sometimes people who are hospitalized are not given the same level of credibility as the practitioners who are testifying that they should be hospitalized. And that is going to result in people staying longer in hospitals than maybe they should. And then, the opposite's true, right? Because if I do a suicide assessment and I deem that you are safe, there's some subjectivity in how I did the suicide assessment. So there's a reliability issue between practitioners, whether they get the same result. So there are some people who could have benefited from hospitalization and who don't. And I see that a lot of them need their degrees taken away. I would say if there is a case of medical malpractice, you can report it to the licensure board. And they take that very seriously if there is a case of medical malpractice. Now, we can't take away their degree, right? If a person has a doctoral degree in psychology, they have a doctoral degree in psychology. We can take away their license, though, because a license is a privilege. It's got to be earned and maintained. And I think that's what you meant anyway. But, sometimes consumers may feel that they've been wronged and maybe they haven't. Obviously, I know that this comment is coming from somewhere in the classroom, so I'm not suggesting that's the case here, but there are times when people will make a claim to the licensure board because they're just unhappy with their practitioner. So everything is treated seriously. There is a board hearing for every complaint. So if there is a complaint against a practitioner, that is treated seriously. And then the decision of the board is to either censure them, but not take away their license, revoke their license temporarily, or in some cases, if it's so egregious, they can have a permanent license revocation where they can never practice again. And that does happen from time to time too. But so that's the process. And now I will say, and I read this in the comments, that there is a pressure in Western nations to put you on medication. So in the United States, in Canada, places like that, there is a belief that medication can be useful in reducing symptoms. And what I will tell you about medication is it's not a one size fits all. I'm a psychologist. I believe in the power of talk therapy. I believe from mind to mind, we can address your psychological condition. So based on that, I believe that that therapy is quite useful, even in the absence of medication. However, as you've seen with me, it's not a one size fits all. There are some conditions where it might be absolutely necessary for a person to be on medication right away. There are some conditions where it is beneficial for medication, but the recommendation is first try therapy, then medication as like some supportive adjunctive treatment. And then there are some conditions where we could argue that they could be treated with talk therapy alone in the absence of medication. So it's not a one size fits all. You know, when we think of things like schizophrenia, if a person is actively hearing voices, I have no problem with, you know, the suggestion of medication from the onset. Now, I will tell you, there is a movement called the Hearing Voices Network, who suggests that embrace the voices rather than the medication. Acknowledge that you're hearing voices, don't respond to the voices, but you don't need medication. That's a position. I think it's safer with medication in such a condition. There are other conditions where it could be helpful, but I would try cognitive therapy first, such as ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There are a lot of great cognitive skills that can help a person without necessarily putting them on Ritalin or Adderall at first. So I always recommend, hey, let's try these tactics, these skills before we move on. And then there are some conditions where you can see that they could be treated exclusively with talk therapy without medication. Now, if it doesn't work, then it gets bumped up to that second stage of, or a second, you know, one where, hey, maybe we'll try medication later. But there are a lot of cases of major depressive disorder, for example, that you can treat with talk therapy alone. And interesting to note that a lot of the antidepressants work marginally better than placebo effect. And many of the antidepressants work better for anxiety than depression. There's a whole lot to be said about this. I'm reacting to the chat. That's why I'm adding some of this other stuff, but it's delicate, right? When we talk about mental health, it's delicate, and we certainly should not put everybody into the same box. We have to evaluate each individual, providing them human dignity, and making sure whatever course of action we're doing is appropriate for that individual. Because in the end, that person has the right to dignity and respect in their treatment. And I always say, well, what if this was my spouse? What if this was my child? What if this was my parent? Am I treating this individual the same way that I would want them to be treated, like a family member? So we have, you know, I've seen some stuff that is written in a chat, and I apologize for those in the profession that have harmed you. But I wouldn't say that throw everything out. And I know you're not suggesting that either. But in any event, let's continue with our lesson. So when we talk about major depressive disorder, it's found in virtually all cultures, but the prevalence differs from place to place, right? So if we were to look at the United States, right, and use the criteria of depression in the United States and compare that to China, China has about 1/5 of the observed depression of Westernized nations. So what's some of the rationale for that? Well, it could come from two aspects, right? So one is somatization. So when it comes to European American tendencies, there is more of a cognitive reaction to depression, versus when it comes to non-Western populations, there tends to be a more somatic explanation. So these are more physiological, right? And when a person reports physiological symptoms, they usually go to their primary care physician. They're not going to a psychologist or a psychiatrist to be diagnosed with a mental health condition, right? So, and anxiety is another one where a person says, oh, I think I'm having chest pain. I think I'm having a heart attack, to discover that they've been having panic attacks, right? So there is this somatization of features. It's more prevalent in the Chinese population. And the other is the psychologization of features, which is where in Western populations, there's more of an emphasis on the psychological features versus the physical. All right, now let's talk about neurasthenia. Neurasthenia, neuro is related to the brain, or neurons. Asthenia is related to anxiety, right? So neurasthenia together results in poor appetite, headaches, insomnia, inability to concentrate. Now, it's interesting that in the DSM, this was dropped, right? Because these are more physiological relative to psychological. And the DSM was on mental disorders predominantly, right? Now, if we were to compare symptoms, the symptoms do overlap to some degree with depression. So some have actually argued that most of these Chinese neurasthenia cases would actually qualify as depression, right? Even though only 9% of people with neurasthenia suggest or reported being depressed. Now, you know, these last two slides are important to me because actually my first clinical experience was in a psychiatric hospital. That's why I told you everything on the last slide. My pre-doctoral internship was at the Hamilton Madison House. And the Hamilton Madison House is in Lower Manhattan. And it is a community mental health center that treats predominantly the Asian community, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, and so forth. And we would see this. We would see people reporting physiological symptoms. And, you know, there is this mental health stigma in particularly the Chinese population. And if it was the idea of going to a psychologist, they might reject that. But if it was going to get physiological symptoms treated, then it's okay. This actually, I've seen this in real life, actually. So to me, it's fascinating. Now, so one explanation, as I said, was that there is this stigma, and the more community oriented you are, or the society you come from is, the more you run the risk of being cut off from the society you belong to. So it should not shock you that Chinese individuals are far less motivated to acknowledge psychological impairment because of stigma. It could result in them being viewed as defective or not part of the community. And I already told you Western versus East Asians in terms of the symptoms they focus on. Now, social anxiety disorder. You might hear social anxiety disorder referred to as social phobia, right? A social anxiety disorder is where a person has an exaggerated fear related to how they're going to present themselves. Either they're worried that they look foolish or they're going to make a fool of themselves, right? So feeling that you're going to embarrass yourself, whether it's real or imagined, results in somehow interfering with your social activities, right? So people who have social phobia oftentimes retreat from social settings, social gatherings. They're less likely to go to things like, I don't know, a senior prom or a conference, things like that. Any kind of social situation that requires them to perform. is going to result in that anxiety. So there's a lot of avoidance there. When we look at the same European American versus East Asian paradigm, we see that with social anxiety disorders, East Asian individuals show more anxiety symptoms than European anxieties. And what does that mean? There's anxiety about how one is going to be perceived, how one is going to perform relative to the expectation of them. And if we were to take the logic that we've been using in many lectures throughout the semester, that there's a sense of interdependence, connectedness, that individual relative to their community. So there's anxiety of not performing relative to the standards of society. And that's what results in it being higher. Now, in East Asian countries, we do see it not documented as much. And, we see it more common in East Asians, in Western nations acknowledging it more. All right. So to me, I think that there's a paradox at play as well, right? If we see East Asians experiencing more symptoms, but not meeting the clinical criteria for social anxiety, what's up with that? Well, it could be due to where the person is being screened, right? So if we said in East Asian countries it's less documented relative to America, it could be that in Western cultures, the norm is for people to be extroverted. So if a person has social anxiety or is more reserved or retreats from social settings, there's more pathology linked to that. Versus in East Asian cultures where the norm is to be more reserved and to be more introverted, then this person retreating from social situations is considered normal. And there's going to be less diagnosis in East Asian countries for that reason too. All right, so there is a culture-bound disorder in East Asian country that's very similar to social anxiety disorder called Taijan Kyufushu, which is the fear of confronting others, right? And this disorder is linked to places like Japan, China, and South Korea. When people have this condition, it's usually triggered or elicited by being in social situations, and it makes them concerned about how people are going to feel related to their eye contact, their body smell, right? Because with anxiety, a person's going to sweat more, and that could come with odor and actual physical manifestation of sweating. So a person who has the fear of confronting others might be worried about, am I hygienically sound? Are people going to judge me? Am I bothering people? Am I causing other people discomfort? To an extreme degree, right? Where that's going to result in them avoiding social settings. So we talked about suicide, right? When we talk about suicide rates, they fluctuate from part to part of the world. So in Eastern European nations, they tend to have the highest rates of suicide. In Muslim nations, they tend to have the lowest rates of suicide. And in the Muslim nations, that's attributed to a very clear statement that it is forbidden to commit suicide, right? Or to engage in suicidal gestures or actions, right? So that's very important to understand. Now you'll see on the graph, you start to see these different depictions from individual countries. But as I said, if we were to take larger groups of communities, you'll see Eastern Europeans tend to have the highest rates. Now, older adults tend to be more likely to commit suicide in most cultures. And if you look at the graph, I think that's pretty well depicted, except for Micronesia. But why is it that older adults are more likely to attempt or complete suicide? The answer is that when a person feels like either they have no purpose or they lost their social network because they're older adults and their friend network has passed away before them, or they have medical conditions where they feel like they can no longer do the things that they used to, it really taxes one's identity and sense of purpose. And people say, well, I don't want to be here anymore. And then, suicide is one of the ways that people deal with that. Certainly not, and I'm superimposing a bias here, but certainly not the best way to deal with it. If I could foster a sense of purpose, I'd rather that than a person committing suicide. But each state and each country has different views on things like euthanasia and assisted suicide. So just because I have my own belief set doesn't mean that it is the rule. Now, when we talk about the case of Micronesia, we saw the spike occurs in adolescence from 15 to 24 in this graph, right? So what's up with that, right? So one suggestion is that because many Micronesia nations have become more westernized, people are losing the traditional role of what it means to be a young man and the responsibilities that come from that. So again, that sense of purpose is being lost, and perhaps that's increasing the rates of suicide in Micronesia. So we talked about this to some degree, or I alluded to this, right? Feeling a loss of connection between one's cultural narrative and modern society, or feeling disconnected or alienated from the larger culture, put people at risk of suicide, as was the case with the Micronesia nations, right? So we also see some challenges related to First Nations or indigenous populations in the United States and Canada, right? So due to colonization, people feel kind of not as connected to their culture of origin, but not American enough or Western enough. So there is this increased loss of sense of self. So we do see that substance use rates among First Nations in both Canada and the United States are highest of all ethnic group. So if we were to look at alcoholism and I were to ask you, well, what ethnic group has the highest rates of alcoholism in North America, it would be First Nations or Indigenous Americans, right? And that, one of the factors is, this historical trauma of, being stripped of one's culture, being stripped of one's identity, but, also feeling like one has to hold on to it so they don't fit into the mainstream culture. So we see that, and that increases the risk of suicide as well. Now, so if we look at evidence for this, we tend to see that those societies where a person has a stable connection with their cultural heritage, they have lower rates of suicide. Now, how might this work? How might we demonstrate a connection? And I think that this might be a public policy thing that we should think about in the United States. I can't speak for Canada, but certainly if a person feels their agency enough to negotiate a land claim with the government saying, hey, wait a minute, this was my land before it was colonized. I want a piece for myself. And that is granted. That certainly makes a person feel more connected to their cultural heritage, right? And I don't think that we have enough invitation for Native Americans or Indigenous Americans to suggest that this was my land and I want it back. We don't have enough of that. I know we have reservations, but when you leave that reservation, you don't feel like you have anything else beyond that reservation. Possessing self-government, we do have this to some degree. On reservations, there is the right for one's self-governance. So that's good to some degree. And then, we also see that there are specialized educational services specifically on these reservations. Now, what I will tell you, though, is historically that was not the case. And if you look at the trauma, even in New York, upstate New York, there are large groups of Indigenous Americans or Native Americans, and they were forced to cut their hair and go to Catholic schools oftentimes, and were punished for their ideologies that were Native American, to the point where they were being forcibly stripped of their identity. That's a problem. Now we do see more invitation for members of the community to regulate their own educational service. We also see that there's the civil service is within the society. So many reservations have their own police forces, fire departments. They have their own health services, IHS, for example, Indian Health Services. They have a whole structure. But, this is relatively new, because if we look in the last 100 years, even in New York, this was not the case. You can watch documentaries of the horrors that many Native Americans experienced. So it would not shock me that suicide rates are higher among Native Americans. It would not shock me that there's more suspiciousness to non-Native Americans. But all in all, it looks like we've moved in the right direction, with the exception of the first bullet point. I don't think we've done enough there about offering reparations and offering the opportunity for people to advocate for their land back. If you have all of these, you're going to certainly be less likely to commit suicide. But, even if you don't have all of them, the more you have, the better it's going to be. So even though we have suicide as a problem across culture, the rates differ across culture, and the motivations differ across culture. So in Western nations, it's oftentimes linked to feelings of depression or substance abuse. In non-Western nations, it's often linked to not being able to accept one's responsibility or for the purpose of honor, such as in Japan. Now, schizophrenia, again, schizophrenia is a universal disorder. It's one of the most debilitating mental disorders we have. It occurs in about 1% of the US population, but the rates differ across the world. And we see that there are, biological factors related to schizophrenia, such as several genes we've found. We've seen that neurotoxins prenatally, viruses prenatally could impact the rates of schizophrenia. And we see that the brain structure is different with individuals with schizophrenia. Now, in the DSM-5, we have what's called schizophrenia spectrum disorders. Similar to autism spectrum disorders, there's a range of features one could have, but typically we look for at least two of the following. So delusions are false beliefs. Now, we all have false beliefs, right? We call these cognitive errors. But a delusion is when a person adheres to that false belief, even in the presence of evidence to the contrary. So an example of delusions could be a delusion of grandeur. So a delusion of grandeur is the belief that one is a major person in history, such as if I were to say, I am John F. Kennedy. Well, John F. Kennedy, we know historically was assassinated, so I can't be John F. Kennedy. But nevertheless, if I say no, I'm John F. Kennedy, you provide birth certificate, death certificates of JFK. You provide DNA testing, and it doesn't match. You provide all this evidence, and for every time you provide evidence that I'm not John F. Kennedy, I reject it for some reason. So that's delusion or delusional thinking. So it's false beliefs. Whereas hallucinations are perceptual disturbances. So they can be auditory, they can be visual, they could be tactile, they can be olfactory, and they could be related to taste, right? So any one of the five senses, you can have a hallucination. The two most common hallucinations are auditory and visual, in that order. Those are the two most common. And the most concerning of hallucinations is when a person gets auditory command hallucinations. That is when they believe that they are being told or directed to commit some activity or harm. There was a famous case, I want to say almost 20 years ago, maybe 30 at this point, with a person who had schizophrenia by the name of Goldstein in New York, which pushed a person in front of a train. And this individual had been in and out of the psychiatric hospitals many times within a single year. But as I said, we're not going to hold a person in a hospital indefinitely. If a person goes back to their baseline, then that's good, right? And we don't want to keep you as a prisoner, so to speak, in a hospital. So this person had been in and out of the hospital, and then when he went out of the hospital, he stopped taking his medication, and he pushed someone in front of a train, and he said he was told to do it, right? And that's an auditory command hallucination. And as a function of this historical event, New York created a law that suggested that if a person has been in and out of the hospital 3 or more times in 18 months, then you are required to provide outpatient services and supervise them outpatient in the community to make sure that they remain safe until demonstrated otherwise. So this is an example of auditory hallucinations and the risk of harm to another person. Disorganized speech, this isn't just rambling. If it were just rambling, I think every professor, myself included, could be suggested that we have disorganized speech. But this is something called, if you have things like word clanging. Word clanging is when a person, says sentences that make no sense, but they're just sentences that rhyme but have no major content. So the sky is high, I want to fly. Well, you can make some meaning out of that, but in general, the whole purpose of that sentence is for something to rhyme, but it doesn't have substance necessarily. You could also have loosening of associations, where a person starts talking and then as they're talking, they sort of splinter off to the point where at the end of the conversation, it makes no sense. The loosening of associations could look like this. So I woke up this morning. My cat is beautiful. The Yankees aren't doing so well. Boy, I'm hungry. Right? So here you have all these sentences. Each sentence makes sense in their own right, but the context is lost. How did I jump from sentence to sentence the way we did? Right? So that would be a loosening of associations. Somehow I'm shifting away from what I was saying and you're not seeing the connection. Catatonia. So catatonia is when a person has either immobilization or excessive motor movements. So a catatonic stupor might be where a person gets stuck in a position, body posture for a long period of time, as if they're frozen like a statue. And it's usually some bizarre posture that doesn't match their setting. But a person with catatonia can have excessive motor movement too. And then the negative symptoms of schizophrenia are things like loss of drive, motivation, disconnection with society, these kind of things, loss of an ability to take care of oneself and their hygiene, things of that nature. So these are the 5 prevailing features. And you don't need all of them to have schizophrenia. So, as I said, there's a genetic component to schizophrenia. We see that in a general population, it's about 1%. But if you have a cousin who has the condition, your likelihood of getting schizophrenia is 2%. If you have a sibling that has schizophrenia, your likelihood is 9%. And if you have an identical twin who has schizophrenia, your likelihood is nearly 50% or 48%. So it's interesting, right? How the closer you are with genetic similarity, the greater risk of schizophrenia increases, right? So there's clear that there's a biological element. Now, with this in mind, though, we also have cultural variation too, right? So if we were to look at different subtypes of schizophrenia, we start to see changes across the globe. So if we were to look in the West, the rate of paranoid schizophrenia is about 75%, whereas catatonic schizophrenia is about 1 to 3%. If we look at India, the percentages and which one's more prevalent shift, right? So paranoid schizophrenia is still relatively high, 15%, but catatonia, which was very low in the West, is higher than paranoid schizophrenia in India with 20%. So it's important to understand how this works. Now, we also see that, and it's interesting, you might wonder why this is. Patients in less developed societies have greater recovery rates than those in industrialized nations. So why this is the case is unknown, right? So this is the opposite of what we tend to see with other physical or psychological pathologies. We don't know why this is, but it's important to note this. This argument here is one of the reasons why there is an anti-psychiatry movement growing in many areas, where they say if people in less developed societies recover from schizophrenia at greater rates, and because they're in less developed societies, oftentimes in the absence of Western medicine, we might be over-medicating. And that is the argument for the anti-psychiatry movement. I don't fully land on that side. I can acknowledge that psychiatrists do, the first thing many psychiatrists do is they do write a script. But I don't know if in the absolute it's best to get rid of psychiatry altogether. So I kind of fall in the middle. All right, so when we talk about treatments, when we talk about the process of treatments, because the symptoms and the prevalence of conditions vary across culture, the treatments are usually linked to the presentation of the disorder. So in Western societies, we talk about and we encourage people to express their feelings. So talk therapy is very common in Western society, but there are many societies where it is considered a taboo, particularly amongst males, to express their emotions. So there have to be other ways of dealing with that, right? So now, obviously, talk therapy in Western nations, because we encourage self-expression, right? And we're part of a low context culture. We discussed this earlier in the semester, but there's also differences in seeking and coping with conditions, right? So the idea of going for therapy is a very Eurocentric view. Not everyone's going to do that. In fact, someone might go to their shaman, right? There's shamanism, where a person might get their treatment in places like India and so forth. So we have to think about how people cope with their condition and how people seek treatment. Now, I saw in the chat related to the previous slide, could lifestyles or routines affect the recovery rate? Absolutely, 100%. Those individuals who have a sense of purpose or structure, have order in their life, are more likely to recover versus those people who are left to do whatever and have less structure. And related to lifestyle, I think diet plays a role too. There are a lot of herbal remedies that we don't harness in Western society. And I hope you heard exactly what I said, we don't harness. There are many herbs, medicinal herbs, and dietary factors that could actually promote health and well-being that in Western society we go to a pill. I know that places like Africa, I know places in South America, many indigenous communities as well, tend to rely more on natural medicine. And that lifestyle change could be useful too in explaining the better recovery rate. All right, so when we talk about seeking treatment, East Asians are less likely to seek support. And the moral of the story is there's more of a focus on how seeking support from others will disrupt their relationship with others. Keep in mind, there's a focus on relationships and interdependence. And one of the things that they do is they rely on the implied or implicit social support that they remind themselves, hey, I know if I went to this person, I would get the support, even though I'm not going to them. So feeling like you have the support without necessarily leaning on the person for the support is how it works. And this is partially an explanation, right, why some East Asians are less likely to seek mental health professionals relative to Westerners. So when we think of Western treatments, we think of Freud and Rogers and whatnot. So Freud was looking at your childhood, your early development, your memory and your experiences, right? So the unconscious, things like that. Freud was the first in the line of standard treatments, right? So psychoanalysis was the first treatment tradition. And then Carl Rogers wanted to focus on human potential and growth and development and cognitive distortions to some degree. And so these are more Western belief sets. But when we look at non-Western communities, treatment comes from families, spirituality, and religion. So in a non-Western community, the family plays an important role in supporting you and providing the treatment you need, not, I hate to say it, but a stranger, not a practitioner that's not part of the family. In terms of treatment as well, there's more religion and spiritualism, and we talked about this, right? And even in some conditions. So in non-Western communities, there is a belief that perhaps the psychological disorder is due to some kind of spiritual deficit or spiritual disconnection that occurred or disrupted their connection with the God or with their God or gods, plural, depending on the faith. So the focus in treatment would be how to reconnect or realign one's spiritual belief set. All right. So in terms of Japan, they have different approaches to treatment. So in Japan, there's something called Morita therapy, where there is the attempt to get clients to accept the circumstances of their life, meaning that, okay, you have this condition, what can you do about it? Instead of trying to reject the fact that you have condition, just embrace it. You know, this is your life. This is part of who you are. And, you know, the goal of Morita therapy is to say, hey, you can still live a productive life, even with whatever psychological symptoms you have. So if you have anxiety or depression, you can live a meaningful life, even though you feel anxious. You can live a meaningful life, even though you feel very heavy or burdened, right? So teaching people to remain productive is the primary focus. So here's an example of some things that could be part of your treatment plan. You could have manual tasks that are light lifting, such as sweeping, or heavy manual labor, such as chopping wood. And the activity of doing this is going to give you the realization that you can be productive. I don't know if any of you have this experience, but when you're angry or frustrated, you might go to cleaning. Why is it that we do this? Well, for some of us, it's a simple distraction. We don't want to think about it. For others, it might be that this is something I have control over. Even though there's other things that are chaotic in my life, I have control over it. So that's the kind of interpretation. The second one that's most linked to Morita therapy is that, hey, you still can control whether you do the dishes, whether you sweep the floor, whether you go shopping, things like that. You still have control over. You can be meaningful right? And then yes, in some ways it could also give you the catharsis or release that you're looking for from whatever frustration. So we also have Nikon therapy to help people work on depression and substance use disorders. So here is kind of teaching people to become a little bit more selfless versus when it comes, particularly with substance use disorders, people become very self-oriented. The goal is to get high at any cost, even if it means harming other people around them. For example, if a person had their rent money in this hand and the choice for drugs in this hand, they might spend their rent money on drugs rather than paying the rent. So that could cause harm to other people. So Nikon therapy would be to think about the grace and kindness that other people have given this individual who has a substance use disorder or depression, in spite of, and this is the harsher part, how little they've offered in return. Now, the harsher, I say this is harsh because people with depression, I don't think that this is something that they're trying to offer little in return. They might feel that they have little to offer so that they don't offer, right? So that's harsh. Whereas in substance use, you can concretize and say, hey, you've exploited your parents, you've stolen jewelry from your siblings, pawned this, that, or another, and you can actually concretize how they've caused harm. So this cognitive exercise of showing gratitude or reflecting on the kindness that they've received from others and the duality of them not offering that in return is meant to create some humility. That's the goal. Yes, both Nikon and Morita therapy are Japanese. All right, so we have to think about the benefit of therapy and whether or not therapy is helpful or harmful as well. I would tell you that in general, therapy can be useful, but sometimes it's harmful. So even in a Western context, 95% of people who receive therapy find some benefit in it, and it's helpful in personal growth. But there is a 5% of people who are harmed by the therapy they receive, even though the person's trying to help them. How is that possible? Well, in one situation, if a therapist engages in a practice they're not trained to do, they could harm the people they're treating due to their lack of experience in that treatment. Or if the recommendations are more based on the personal biases of the practitioner, ignoring the cultural value system of the client, it could do harm. And these are just a couple examples of how we as practitioners could harm other people. Now, as I said, it's important to think about this. That was within a Western society. All the more so when we superimpose Western treatments on the non-Western world, right? So, for example, when we talk about anorexia nervosa, right? Some people have suggested that anorexia did not manifest in Hong Kong the same way it manifests in Europe and the United States until it was imported there. Now, what do you mean it was imported there, right? The idea is that it was, literature was brought into Hong Kong about anorexia, and then people started to self-identify, hey, I have this, if that makes sense, right? So Western clinician said, okay, here, this is anorexia, it must be this person has it. And here's the problem with that. If you take a health psychology class, BMI charts in the United States don't conform to BMI charts in places like Hong Kong. So people tend to have a lower weight and frame relative to Western nations in general. So you're going to overdiagnose anorexia in places like Hong Kong. Another example is PTSD. When we think of the tsunami that occurred in 2004 in Sri Lanka, people did not report having PTSD until Western aid workers came in and insisted you're demonstrating traumatic stress. So we can superimpose conditions on other people based on our framework, which could be harmful. Now, it's interesting because COVID-19, right? That's a pandemic that affected many parts of the world. And some of my colleagues have volunteered to offer training to places like India. And I don't know if you remember, in India, there was a time when there were so many bodies of people dying of COVID-19 that they were burning them in parking lots. And one of my colleagues in particular, who's an expert in trauma, said, well, I want to train aid workers in India how to work with trauma. And, I'm sure they're well-intentioned, but I wonder if some of the things that are in the training could be biased based on a Western worldview. I don't know. I didn't watch the training. I'm not suggesting my colleague did anything wrong, but based on the slide, there is the potential for harm when we superimpose Western diagnoses or ideologies on the non-Western world. Okay, so what should we be aiming for? We should be aiming for cultural competence, right? All of us should be aiming for cultural competence. We need to understand our cultural value systems. We need to understand our biases, and we need to understand the cultures a person belongs to make sure we're giving proper treatment. And be mindful, the person is the expert on them and their culture, not you. So when in doubt, seek advice, seek consultation. I'm gonna stop there. And I realized just now, no one told me, but I went slightly over. So I'm gonna stop there, and we'll stop there. And those of you who wanna see me, my office hours are in a brief 5 minutes from now. Take care, everybody.
Take care.